The morning she overheard her husband describe her to his colleague as the arrangement that made financial sense. Genevieve Ashworth set down her tea and did not say a word. She had been standing just outside the study door, not eavesdropping. She had simply come to ask whether he wanted supper brought in, the way she always did on the evenings he worked late. She had even paused to straighten the small oil painting in the hallway, the one that hung slightly crooked, because the wall anchor never quite held. She had her hand raised to knock when she heard it. The arrangement that made financial sense. His voice was easy, almost amused. The way you'd describe a carriage that ran well enough, or a property that turned a modest return. She lowered her hand. She walked back down the corridor. She sat at the dining room table, alone, and finished her tea while it was still warm. Outside, the November wind came off the lake and pressed against the windows, and the house made the sounds old houses make when they settle, groaning softly, adjusting to the cold, the way people do. She had been married to Mr. Harlan Ashworth for 3 years and 4 months. She had known, of course. That was the thing no one tells you about arrangements. You always know. You know it on the day itself, when you walk toward a man who is watching the door rather than you, counting the minutes until the formality concludes, so the real business can begin. You know it in the first weeks, when conversation comes in careful, measured increments, like water rationed in a drought. You know it when you learn the shape of his silences, which ones mean nothing, which ones mean I would rather be elsewhere, which ones mean I have already forgotten you are in the room. Genevieve had learned all of his silences. She had become, without meaning to, a scholar of them. Her name before the marriage had been Genevieve Colbert. Her father, Mr. Colbert, had been a solicitor of some reputation in Halifax, and when he died in the spring of her 22nd year, he left behind a modest estate, a great deal of goodwill, and a daughter who was, as the family's solicitor explained with careful delicacy, best provided for through a suitable match. The Ashworths had land north of the city, a shipping interest that was either thriving or troubled depending on which month you asked, and a son of 30 who needed, according to his own mother, someone steady and undemanding. Genevieve had understood that she was being described. She had nodded, and said very little, and thought, at least he is not unkind. That much had proven true. Harlan Ashworth was not unkind. He did not raise his voice. He did not humiliate her in company. He paid the household accounts without complaint and asked after her health when he remembered to. He was, by most measures that the world cared to apply, a perfectly adequate husband. He simply did not see her, not really, not in the way that matters. In the first year Genevieve had tried. She had arranged dinners and learned which topics interested him. The shipping routes, the politics of the harbor authority, the question of the new railway extension. She had read the papers so she could speak to these things. She had redecorated the sitting room in colors she'd seen him pause at in a catalog, hoping he would notice. He had not mentioned it for 6 weeks. And when he finally did, he said only, "Did you change something in here?" and moved on before she could answer. In the second year, she stopped trying to be noticed and started, instead, to be useful. She managed the house with real competence. The staff, the accounts, the maintenance that always seems to accumulate when a man is too busy to attend to it. She befriended the tenants on the Ashworth property, outside the city, a handful of farming families who were struggling through 2 difficult seasons. She organized small practical things. A lending arrangement for seed, a shared use of equipment, introductions between a young widow who sewed well and a dress shop in town that needed reliable alterations work. She did not tell Harlan about most of this. It did not seem like something he would want to hear. In the 3rd year, she simply lived quietly. She read a great deal. She walked along the harbor in the mornings. She wrote long letters to her cousin Rosalind, who had married a doctor in Montreal, and who wrote back with real warmth and occasional exasperation at the state of Genevieve's situation, which Rosalind called, not incorrectly, a waste of a perfectly capable woman. She did not make a scene. She did not weep, or plead, or perform unhappiness for an audience. She was by nature a private person. She kept her grief the way she kept her accounts, carefully, methodically, in a place where she was the only one with access. The evening she heard herself described as a financial arrangement, something in her shifted. Not broke, she was past breaking. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of a door, very gently, closing. She finished her tea. She washed her own cup. She went upstairs, and in the small writing desk beside the window, she took out a sheet of paper and began to write to her cousin in Montreal. "I think," she wrote, "that I have been waiting for something that is not coming. I am not sure what to do with that knowledge yet. But I think I need to stop waiting." She sealed the letter. She did not post it that night. She held it for 2 days, the way you hold a decision before you commit to it, turning it over, checking the weight of it. On the third day she posted it, and then she sat down and began, very quietly, to plan. It was not a dramatic plan. Genevieve had never been drawn to drama. Rosalind's husband, Dr. Emile Renault, had a colleague in Toronto, a Dr. Hartwell, who was opening a small private clinic and needed someone with organizational capacity to manage the administrative work. Rosalind had mentioned this months ago. In the speculative way, she mentioned things she thought Genevieve should consider but didn't want to push. Genevieve had filed it away and said nothing. Now she wrote directly to Dr. Hartwell and asked whether the position had been filled. It had not. She made 2 trips to see a solicitor, not the family firm, a different one. A woman named Mrs. Dautrive, who had a small practice on Barrington Street, and who looked at Genevieve across the desk without a trace of pity or judgment, which was exactly what Genevieve needed. They discussed what the legal reality of her situation was, and what options existed, and what she was and was not entitled to under the terms of the marriage settlement her father's solicitor had drawn up. She had more options than she'd assumed. She did not tell Harlan any of this. She did not tell the household staff, though she suspected that Mrs. Fenn, who had managed the kitchen for 14 years and missed very little, had an idea that something was in motion. Mrs. Fenn began, without being asked, to make Genevieve's favorite things for supper on Thursdays, which was either coincidence or the particular tenderness of a woman who understood more than she said. Over the course of 6 weeks, Genevieve made her arrangements. She organized the household records and left them in meticulous order. She wrote careful notes about each of the tenant families. Who was reliable, who was struggling, what each situation needed from whoever came to look after things next. She left addresses, contacts, small practical observations that she had accumulated over 3 years of quiet attention. She did not know whether any of it would be used. She left it because it was the responsible thing, and because she had made promises to those people. Not formal ones, not the kind anyone would hold her to, but the kind you make anyway when you have looked someone in the eye and said, "I'll see what I can do." She said her goodbyes without saying they were goodbyes. To Mrs. Fenn she said, "Thank you for everything, you keep a very good house." To the tenant families she visited one last time on a gray March afternoon, bringing a hamper from the market and staying long enough to make sure that the young widow, her name was Tilda, had everything she needed for the next quarter's work. Then she went home, packed 2 cases, and left. She did not leave a dramatic letter. She left a short one, 3 sentences, placed on the desk in the study where she knew he would find it before morning. "I have taken a position in Toronto. My solicitor will be in contact regarding the formal separation. I wish you well, Harlan. I mean that plainly, without sentiment." She took the early train. She watched the harbor disappear behind her in the winter light, and she felt, not happiness, not yet, but something like the first clean breath after a long time indoors. Harlan Ashworth found the letter at 7:30 in the morning, when he came into the study for his first cup of tea. He read it twice. He set it down. He picked it up and read it a 3rd time. His first thought, and he would be ashamed of this later, was, who will manage the Henderson account correspondence? Because Genevieve had always handled the filing, the follow-up letters, the administrative layer of his work that he'd stopped noticing 3 years ago, because it was always simply done. His second thought arrived more slowly, the way truths do when they've been kept waiting long enough. He sat down in the chair behind his desk. He did not touch the tea. He sat for a long time with the letter in his hands, and he became aware, in the particular silence of a house from which one person has recently departed, of exactly how much space she had occupied. Not loudly, not demandingly, just steadily, the way a fire occupies a room. You don't think about it until it's gone, and then the cold is everywhere. The week that followed was instructive in a way Harlan had not anticipated and did not enjoy. He discovered that the household accounts were flawless, but that he had no idea how to navigate them. The filing system was logical and efficient, and entirely foreign to him, because he had never once looked at it. He discovered that his correspondence with 2 of the Harbor Authority members had been, on inspection, diplomatically composed in ways that were not quite his style. Slightly warmer, slightly more careful about tone, and he realized, with a lurch, that Genevieve had been managing his professional relationships at a level he had not noticed, and had certainly not thanked her for. He discovered, when he went to the estate north of the city for the first time in 4 months, that the tenants were organized and productive in ways they hadn't been 3 years ago, and that when he mentioned this to the older farmer, a man named Birch, The man looked at him with a kind of measured respect that is distinctly reserved for people who have done something to earn it, and said, "Your wife saw to a great deal, Mr. Ashworth. She had a real understanding of what people need." Harlan drove back to the city and sat with that for a long time. He had described her to his colleague. He remembered it now, exactly, as the arrangement that made financial sense. He had said it without thinking, the way you say things you believe without having examined. She had been in the house. He had known she was in the house. He had never once asked himself what it cost her to be in that house, day after day, being useful and steady and entirely unacknowledged. He had thought, she seems content. She does not complain. He had not thought to ask whether contentment and silence were the same thing. He wrote to her in Toronto. The first letter was awkward. He was not a man who found words easy, and he was asking for something he couldn't quite name and didn't entirely deserve, and he knew it. He explained himself badly. He was too formal in some places and unexpectedly blunt in others. He sent it before he could overthink it, and then spent 3 days regretting the second paragraph. She wrote back. Her letter was brief and not unkind, but it was clear she was well. She had work she found meaningful. She was not angry. She said this directly, which surprised him, because he had been bracing for anger and didn't quite know what to do with its absence. She said, "I don't think either of us knew how to be married to each other. But I think I was the only one of us who noticed that this was a problem." He read that sentence 5 or 6 times. He thought, she is right. He thought, how did I not see this? He thought, with a clarity that arrived too late and too fully, I was not paying attention. I was not paying attention for 3 years, and she waited, and I didn't. He wrote again. He wrote differently this time, without the formality, without the hedging. He told her about the farmer Birch, and what Birch had said, and how it had landed. He told her about finding her notes on the tenant families, the careful observations, the addresses, the small logistics of care she had left for a successor she must have known might not exist. He said, "You left those notes for people you were never going to see again. I don't know why that is the thing that made me understand, but it is." She did not write back immediately. When she did, her letter was longer. Spring came to Halifax and then, slowly, to Toronto, and Genevieve found herself doing something she had not done in 3 years. Waking up in the morning with something to look forward to. The clinic work suited her. Dr. Hartwell was a practical man who did not require warmth but respected competence, and he recognized hers immediately and without condescension, which was a novelty she had to resist the urge to comment on. The work was organizing, problem-solving, the management of small complex systems, which she was, it turned out, very good at. She had always been good at it. She had just been good at it in a house where no one was looking. She had a small flat near the university, 2 rooms that were entirely her own. She arranged them the way she wanted. A chair near the window for reading, the good lamp on the writing desk, the kitchen uncluttered in the particular way that pleases people who have spent time managing someone else's idea of a household. She made her own tea at her own hour. She walked in the evenings. She had supper on Thursdays with Rosalind and Emile, who were kind and funny and asked real questions and listened to the answers. She was, for the first time in a long time, not performing. Harlan's letters continued. She read them carefully and with more interest than she had expected. She had known him as a man of few unnecessary words. She had not known, or had forgotten, that when he chose to use words he used them precisely. His letters were not romantic. They were not an attempt at courtship. They were something stranger and more honest. They were a man trying to account for himself, with the full knowledge that the accounting might not be enough, and writing it down anyway. He told her things she hadn't known. He told her about his father, and the shape of the marriage his parents had, and the lesson he had absorbed. Without noticing he had absorbed it, that a wife was a household function, rather than a person you were in a relationship with. He said, "I am not offering that as an excuse. I am offering it as an explanation, which is a different thing, and even an explanation is not the same as a reason." She wrote back, "I know the difference. I appreciate that you do too." She was not ready to go back. She was not sure she would ever be ready to go back to the same house, the same rooms, the same arrangement. But she admitted this to Rosalind one Thursday evening over bad wine and good bread. She was not done with him. She was not sure what that meant. She was not going to rush it. In June, he came to Toronto. He did not show up without warning. He wrote first, asking if he might visit, and stating clearly that he would understand if the answer was no. The asking was careful, and left her a genuine exit, which was more than she would have expected from the man she'd left, though she was beginning to understand that the man she'd left was not the whole of him, only the part she had been given access to. She said yes. They walked along the lakeshore in the long June light, and it was strange, not badly strange, but the strangeness of two people who had lived in the same house for 3 years, and were now finally, actually meeting. He asked her real questions. She asked some back. He said, "You managed the Henderson correspondence for 8 months before I noticed, didn't you?" She said, 11 months actually. He looked at the lake. He said, "I'm sorry, Genevieve. Not as a strategy, not as an entry point to something else. Just the words, plain, with the full weight of what he was sorry for behind them." She did not say it's all right, because it hadn't been, she said. "I know." They sat on a bench near the water, and she told him about the clinic, the work, the flat, the evenings with Rosalind. He listened in the way she had not seen him listen before, without waiting for his turn, without half his attention elsewhere. He told her about Birch again, and about the tenants, and how he'd tried to continue what she'd started, and how he was doing it badly but learning. He said, "I found your notes. The ones about the families, the one about Tilda, the seamstress. There was a whole page about her situation. I went to see her. She's doing well." He paused. "She asked after you." Something in Genevieve's chest shifted. "Did she?" she said. "And she said I could tell you this." She said, "Tell Mrs. Ashworth that the shop gave me a permanent contract, and that I named the cat after her." Genevieve laughed. It was the surprised kind of laugh. The kind that comes before you can decide to make it. She covered her mouth with her hand, and Harlan looked at her with an expression she had not seen before. Something open, something that was not managing or evaluating, but simply watching, the way you watch something you're glad is still there. "What did she name the cat?" Genevieve asked. "Jenny," he said. "I thought you should know." She looked at the water. She thought about the notes she'd left, the careful handwriting, the addresses of people she'd not expected to see again. She thought about Tilda and the seamstress work and the particular satisfaction of having done a useful thing in a quiet way, without anyone asking you to or thanking you for it. She had done it because it was right. And it had mattered. And even when she had not been there, it had continued to matter. "I'm not ready to come back," she said. "I need you to understand that clearly." "I do," he said. "And I don't know if I ever want to go back to what we had. Because what we had was not a marriage. It was a house we both lived in." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know, I don't want that either. I don't know if I know how to do anything better. But I would like to try. Not for the arrangement, because I have spent the last 3 months learning what you actually are, and I would like, if you're willing, to start from there." She looked at him. The lake was very still. Behind them the city made its usual sounds, the streetcars, the voices, the ongoing noise of a place that does not stop for anyone's private reckoning. She did not say yes. She did not say no. She said, "Come back in August. Write to me in the meantime. We'll see." It was not a promise. It was an open door, the smallest possible crack of light. But Genevieve Ashworth, had learned that she was under no obligation to make things easy or fast or tidy. She had spent 3 years making everything smooth for a man who hadn't noticed. She could take her time now. She had earned that. He came back in August. He came back in October and in December. By the following spring, when the ice on the lake had broken and the city smelled like mud and possibility, they had built something that resembled, for the first time, a genuine understanding. Not romance, not the breathless, fictional kind. Something more durable. Two people who had looked at each other clearly, faults and all, and chosen to stay in the room. The day they walked back into the Halifax house together, Genevieve stood in the front hall for a long moment. The painting in the corridor still hung slightly crooked. She straightened it, the way she always had. Then she went into the study, where she'd heard those words 3 years ago, and she sat down in the chair by the window. Her chair, she had decided, and she opened the book she was currently reading. Harlan came in a few minutes later with 2 cups of tea. He set one beside her without saying anything. She did not look up from her page, but she reached out and put her hand briefly over his and he stayed. That was all. It was at last enough.